Well, hello, Dolf de Roos here, and today I'm going to talk about 4 tips to get started in commercial real estate. And the first one concerns how much money do you actually need to get started in commercial real estate? And look, I want to start with a disclaimer here. If you want to buy a $20 million commercial portfolio, and if you have $20 million in the bank, it's going to be a lot easier than if you have no money in the bank. And buying a $20 million portfolio with $20 million in the bank is pretty easy. You just got to find one that meets your criteria, whatever they are, and then you sign the contract to buy it and you pay the money out of your bank account. This program is not really for people like that, because any fool with 20 million in the bank can buy a 5 or 10 or $20 million portfolio. The trick is, how can you acquire $20 million of commercial real estate if you don't have 20 million in the bank? If you only have 10 million in the bank, still quite easy. Some of you will say you get a 50% mortgage. Or what if you only have 5 million? What if you only have 1 million? What if you have no money? Is it possible? And I'm the first to say it's going to be a lot trickier. You're going to have to work it a lot harder. You're going to have a bit more luck, a bit more foresight, better contacts, but it is possible. And I'm going to show you how it's possible today. Because the thing about commercial real estate is it lends itself to creative financing more, I believe, than residential real estate does. Now let's talk about the conventional way of things, because most people are put off investing in commercial real estate because they perceive, and it's not a completely inaccurate perception, they perceive that it can be more difficult than residential. Why do I say that? With residential property, banks generally are very willing to lend 80% of the purchase price. We talk about an LTV, or loan to value ratio. Sometimes it's called the LVR, loan to value ratio. An LTV of 80%. Banks typically easily lend up to 80% of the registered appraisal of a property before requiring what's called PMI, that's personal mortgage insurance. Meaning if you borrow, if you borrow more than 80%, banks will still do that, but you'll need to take on an insurance so that if you can't pay the mortgage, the insurance company will pay the mortgage for you. And that mortgage insurance, the PMI, comes with a premium, of course, and you have to pay for that. So generally, banks lend up to 80% on residential, whereas on commercial, they may only lend 50%. Occasionally, they lend 60%. Sometimes they've had 65% loans. But the point is, in general, it's going to be lower than the LTV on residential properties. So for that reason alone, many people think it's more difficult to buy commercial real estate because you need a higher proportion of the valuation or appraisal of a property in the form of cash. Secondly, the perception is that in general, commercial properties are a lot more expensive than residential properties. You can buy a house for $500,000 roughly. I know you can buy houses for $100,000, but not in San Francisco or New York or Paris. We're talking about little villages down in the wop-wops or in the outback of nowhere. But generally, 3, 4, 500,000 seems to be within the median price range right now of houses. Whereas commercial buildings are often viewed as being 20-story office towers or whatever that cost $30 million. Or there's a shopping center on the corner somewhere with 8 tenancies and it's $3 million. It's still, in general and on average, a lot more expensive perceptually than a house. So people think, well, commercial real estate is more expensive and banks will lend a lower proportion of the purchase price. Therefore, it's more difficult to buy commercial. Therefore, I'll stick to residential. Well, you can use creative financing. And the first method I want to share is one that can be used both in residential and commercial, but I believe it's more common in commercial. And that is when you buy a property, when you find a commercial deal, you could say to the seller, would you be willing to leave any money in the deal? Another way of putting it is, will there be any vendor financing or seller carryback? It doesn't matter what terminology you use. Get used to all the terminology. Vendor, seller, carryback, financing, leaving money in. It all boils down to the same thing. Now, most people, when they sell a property, they sell it because they need the money. They want to put the money into another deal. So if you ask them, for instance, would you be willing to leave some money? And most of them are going to say, no, are you kidding me? I need the money for something else. But despite that being the norm, don't let it put you off asking. Because in my experience, every 10 times I ask a seller to leave money in, 8 or 9 of them say, no, are you crazy? I'm not going to leave money in. And every now and then, 1 or 2 out of 10 will say, interesting concept. Yes, I would consider that. By the way, why would they consider that? Because generally they can charge an interest rate which is way higher than what they'd earn by putting the proceeds of the sale in the bank. Right now, as you all know, bank interest rates are very low when you put money on deposit. You might get 1/10 of 1%. We all know that there are places like Denmark at the moment where you have to pay the bank to put your money on deposit. You might say, well, why on earth would you do that? Well, what else are you going to do with the money? You're going to stuff it in the form of cash under your mattress. If there's a fire or a theft, you could lose it all. So at least by having money in the bank, it's relatively safe. And nowadays, you have to pay banks for the privilege of putting money on deposit. So, if a seller is just going to sit on the money for a while, they're better off having it in the form of a mortgage. Some people are emotionally attached to the property that they used to own. So by having a mortgage on it, by leaving money in it, they feel they're still part of it, they're still generating revenue from it. And it's a psychological thing more than anything else. I've even had the situation where I asked a couple if they'd consider leaving $500,000 in the deal, and they said they wanted to think about it and sleep on it overnight. They're an elderly couple in their 80s, and they came back the next morning. I thought they were going to turn me down and say no, but they said, we've been thinking about it, and instead of leaving $500,000 in, would you mind if we left in $800,000? Well, that was like Christmas for me, of course, but it's not that I unfairly took advantage of them. It suited them as well. They were elderly, they wanted constant guaranteed income, and they knew that their, whatever I was paying them, 5 or 6% at the time, interest rates were a lot higher back then, whatever I was paying them was more than they could earn in the bank, and they knew that if I didn't pay them, they could take possession of the property again because they held some kind of a mortgage over it, and everyone won out of this. So one of the most creative things you can do is simply to ask for seller finance, and you'll be stunned how often they'll say yes, okay. But there's something else about financing a commercial deal that I find just fascinating. And it is really how I've made most of my money in commercial real estate. And that is that unlike residential real estate, where the value of a house is based essentially on comps, you've got a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom home of 2,500 square feet, 12 years old in a particular street, particular suburb of a particular city. What's it going to sell for? And the answer is exactly the same as any other comparable 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom, 2,500 square foot home, 12 years old roughly. It's going to be based on comps, and it won't really matter much whether that property is tenanted or vacant. You could argue that it is easier to sell a residential property if it's vacant, on the basis that if the purchaser intends to be an owner-occupant, then they're going to want to move into the house. And if you've got a tenant there, you're going to have to get rid of the tenant first. That could take time and effort and energy. Whereas if it's vacant, they can buy it and move in the day of closing, basically. So in general, a residential house sells for whatever the market says it's worth. It's based on comps. You can't influence the sales price. Now, as a seller of a residential property, you might say, you know what, I'm going to charge double what I was charging before. Instead of selling it for $450,000, you're going to try $900,000. But chances are you won't find someone silly enough to buy into that and pay you the $900,000, because they're going to have done their homework too. They will have checked comps as well. So there you have it. You find that a residential property is going to sell for whatever the market value is. And by the way, the rental on a residential property is also based on market values. If houses of this size, age, shape, condition rent for about $1,200 a month or $2,300 a month, whatever the numbers are, then your place, which is similar, is going to rent for about the same amount. So the rent is determined by the market. The purchase price is determined by the market. That means the ratio of the two, the yield, the return on investment, if you like, is also determined by the market. And you'll find that in a particular market, the returns might be 5%. So you're going to get a 5% return when you buy residential property, all determined by the market. Guys, there's nothing good or bad about this. This is just the way it is. Now, when it comes to commercial property, there's a different formula. We don't have a formula where the yield equals the rental income divided by the purchase price. The formula in commercial real estate is that the value of a commercial property is the rental income divided by the cap rate. Now, suddenly you're saying, oh my, so this has gotten complex really quickly. Cap rate, what does that mean? Listen, it's very simple. Cap rate is short for capitalization rate. It's the rate at which you capitalize the rental income to arrive at the value. So let's put some numbers to it. Let's say you've got $100,000 of rental income. And let's say market cap rates are 10%. All that a market cap rate means is it's the average of all the yields that other properties have been selling for. So if cap rates are 10% and the rental is 100,000, then the property is worth the rental income 100,000 divided by 10%, which is $1 million. What it means is that investors are willing to pay $1 million to buy $100,000 of rental income in this particular location. Now, cap rates vary around the country. The lowest cap rates are on Wall Street in New York. They're probably the lowest in the world. They hover around 1.5%, call it 2% for ease of maths. If it's 2%, that means that for that $100,000 of annual income, someone's willing to pay $5 million to buy a building generating $100,000 because that would give them 2% return. Whereas in the backwaters of some podunk town in the middle of nowhere, like 100 miles drive from the nearest Walmart or Walgreens or whatever, cap rates might have to be 20%. What that means is that that same $100,000 of rental income, an investor is only willing to pay $500,000 to buy that $100,000 income. That would give them a 20% return. In other words, the lower the quality of the investment, the higher the interest rate that the investor would have to earn in order to justify investing there. So when cap rates are high, 20%, it's usually a less desirable place to own real estate. And when cap rates are really low, that means the multiplier is really high, like Wall Street in New York, they're willing to suffer a very low cap rate because then the values are high. $100,000 of income, they're willing to pay $5 million for it. So getting back to our example, if cap rates are 10% in whatever area we're looking at, and the rental income is that same 100,000, then the building is worth $1 million. So far, so good. Who determines the cap rate? The market determines the cap rate. But when it comes to who determines the rental, it's not the same as with residential property. We're talking commercial property. So let's say you've got a thrift shop. Nothing good or bad or right or wrong about having a thrift shop. They perform a very useful function in our society. But they might be paying $12 a foot. That's all their business can sustain. But the area has improved because of extra traffic flow and new office towers that have been put in. The value of this property has gone up. And the rental income should no longer be the $12 a foot that the thrift shop is paying. In fact, when the rent comes up for renewal, rents have gone up. They're not going to stay there. They can't afford it. Let's say that you get a coffee shop there, one of the big franchise names, and they're willing to pay $24 a foot. That's double the rent you had before. So the rental will have gone from $100,000 to $200,000. Now bear in mind, cap rates haven't changed. Cap rates in our imaginary example are still 10%. And if that 10% and the rental has gone to $200,000, the value of the building has now gone to $2 million. So unlike residential, where the market determines the rental level and the market determines the capital value of the house, and therefore the returns are determined by the market, when it comes to commercial property, cap rates are determined by the market, but the rental is whatever your creativity can conjure up to generate there. So here's where it gets really interesting. If you find a commercial building, no matter what the price is, let's say it's $1 million and it's generating $100,000 in rent. If you can figure out a way of increasing the rent, if you can figure out a way of doubling it to $200,000, then the value of that building, according to any appraiser, will have gone to $2 million. And when you take that appraisal to the bank, they're going to say, yes, but with commercial, we'll only lend 50 or 60%. Let's say they only lend 50%. 50% of 2 million, that's an easy calculation. That's $1 million. And that's the purchase price we talked about before. So what I'm saying is one of the great things about commercial real estate and one of the great ways of doing financing creatively is that you organize to buy that property at its current market value of $1 million. That's what they're asking for it because that's what the rental shows it's worth. But in the meantime, you've figured out a way of getting more rental. You can double the rental. You take an appraisal based on that new rental, $2 million, you take it to the bank, they give you 50%. That's the entire purchase price. Now, I can't do this with residential. I have not figured out a way of getting banks to fund 100% of my acquisition. But I have. And in case you think this is all words and that it doesn't really work like that in real life, I'll give you a couple of real life examples. I came across a funeral parlor. Now, for those of you who don't know what goes on inside a funeral parlor, they process bodies there, bodies that have stopped breathing. Sorry to put it this bluntly, but it's the truth. and they insert hollow stainless steel tubes into these bodies and extract all the blood and replace it with formaldehyde. And they do a few other things like that. You don't really want to know all the details. They have viewing rooms in there. They have chilling rooms in there. No marks for guessing what they keep chilled. And this funeral parlor had been vacant for 3 years. In other words, neither the seller nor the agents could find a tenant for it. So the building wasn't worth very much. In fact, it had been on the market. It went up for auction. It got passed in. It failed to meet the reserve price of $195,000. And no one knew what to do with it. So I had a look at it, and in case you're wondering whether or not I went ahead and bought it, I did not buy it. The last thing I want to do is own a funeral parlor for which I can't get a tenant. I'd be no better off than the existing seller. But what I did do is I employed someone at the then going hourly rate of $8 an hour to phone every funeral director in concentric circles, basically going further and further away from this place to see if they were at all interested in running a funeral parlor in this town. And most of them said, no, take me off your list. How did you get my number? Don't you dare call me again. Is this a hoax? Things like that. But at the end of 2 days, she found someone who said, I've always wanted to operate there. And that's when she put me on the line. And I said, listen, there is a funeral parlor for sale. If you're interested, why didn't you go and buy it? Now, why would I offer it to him, the operator, when I wanted to buy the building as an investor? Well, here's the truth of it, guys. The last thing I want is a tenant who begrudges the fact that the only reason he's the tenant instead of the owner is that I beat him to the building. He'd resent me for the rest of his days. And I knew that in all probability, and this is actually what happened in this case, in all probability, he wouldn't want to buy the building. He doesn't know how to run real estate. He doesn't want to. He wants to run a funeral operation. And that's exactly what he said. He said, I don't want to buy it. I said, okay, we'll check it out. If you really like it, and if you're willing to sign an LOI, a letter of intent, or a heads of agreement, where subject to me buying the property, you will become the tenant. But if I can't manage to buy the property, then I don't owe you anything. If you're willing to sign that, then I'm willing to have a crack at buying the building. And he stopped me dead in my tracks. He said, not so fast, Sonny Jim. I'll only do it if you give me a long-term lease. Well, this is good. That's one of the advantages of commercial properties. You tend to get long-term leases. So I said, okay, go and have a look. He did. He loved it. He wanted to go ahead. And by the way, I would have been happy with a 5-year lease. But one of my golden rules in my book, Real Estate Riches, is never be the first to name a number, because that person usually always loses. So I said, how much would you be willing to accept as a lease? And he said, I'll do it if you give me 10 years with a right of renewal for another 10 years. He wanted a 20-year lease. This was golden. It was great. So that's exactly what we did. He went ahead. He looked at it. He loved it. He signed the heads of agreement. I had a contract. Pardon me. I had a contract to buy the building at that stage for $170,000. And I got an appraisal based on the fact that I now had a tenant paying effectively $30,000 a year in rent. And by the way, being commercial, it was a triple net lease, which means the tenant paid the outgoings, the property taxes, the insurance, and the maintenance. So with this tenant lined up to be paying me money, I got an appraisal done, and the appraisal came in very conservatively at $240,000. Should it have been more? Yes, of course. In fact, a year after acquiring, I got the same appraiser to appraise the same building, and it had the same tenant, and the rent hadn't gone up because I had 2 yearly rent reviews, and it was only after 1 year. And already the appraiser went up to $300. I think it was the appraiser's acknowledgement that it truly was worth $300 already. However, he didn't say that at the time. He said it was worth $240. And I went to the bank, and I think the bank offered me at the time a 66% mortgage. What it boiled down to is that they offered me $160,000. Now remember, it cost me, my contract price was $170,000. So how much money did I have in the deal? I only had to put $10,000 into the deal. It's so little you could almost say I put no money in the deal. But the truth is I put $10,000 in. Now, I was collecting $30,000 in rent. That's not a bad return. And I said it was triple net. Triple net means it's net of property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. The tenants pay that in addition to the base rent. So unlike a residential property where the landlord collects the rent, but from the rent collected, he has to pay the property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. In this case, the tenant paid it. So was the $30,000 net to me? Well, no. Remember, I said I had a mortgage. I had a P&I mortgage, principal and interest. And in round numbers, that cost me about $15,000 a year initially. The ratio of principal to interest changes and tax deductibility of them, but call it $15,000. So here's a question I have for you. You could say that my return on investment was $30,000 of rental income divided by $170,000 of purchase price, which I think is about 17% return, something like that. Is that my return? Or is my return $15,000 cash out? That's my rental income less my mortgage, $15,000 net coming out on an investment, a cash investment of only $10,000. 15 out of $10,000 is 150% return every year. My question to you, serious question, is was my return 17% or was it 150%? And the answer is, obviously, it was both of those returns. It depends on how you define the return. One is the rental income divided by the purchase price, and then the other one is net cash out over net cash in. There's another return that you could take into consideration, and that's doing the after-tax return, because you might think that I had to pay tax on the $15,000 coming out, and technically I do. However, it doesn't take account of depreciation. And you can depreciate real estate. In this particular place where I bought this property, you had a choice of 2.5% straight line or 4% diminishing value. In other words, you could claim 4% of the purchase price of $170,000 against your income in the first year. Well, that's 4,000 for 720, that's 6,800. So instead of paying tax on 50,000, you pay tax on 15,000 minus 6,800, which is just over, it's 8,200. Not even, it's 7,200. No, it's 8,200. So, and then there are other things you can depreciate. So it depends on how you define the return, but whichever way you define it, I think you'll agree, 17%, 150%, it's a good deal. Pardon me. So it's one of those things where with commercial, you can do things that you cannot begin to think of doing with residential because it lends itself to being more flexible. So we've talked about creative financing where you ask the seller to leave money in, or you can figure out a way of generating more rental income from this property. And in doing so, the value goes up extraordinarily. And then you just borrow the modest LTV that banks will give you on commercial, 50, 60, 66%, whatever it is. And that might cover all or most of your purchase price. These are pretty exciting things, I think, to do. So it does beg the question, okay, where do you go and find properties like these? Where do we go and look for them? And there are many ways of doing that. One of them is simply to go onto all the electronic sites. And it depends on which country you live in and even which state or province within a country. But one that we use here in the States a lot is LoopNet. I forget whether it's loopnet.com or loopnet.net because whenever I type loop and it finishes it for me. But check it out. They might have both URLs. So you go there and you'll find a plethora of properties available. There's Crexy, there's Zillow, of course, and there are so many sites. There are individual real estate firms. I'm not endorsing any of them by mentioning them, but Marcus Millichamp and CB Richard Ellis and Jones Lang Wood, and they're now Jones Lang LaSalle. Check out all the sites. It doesn't matter where you get a listing from. A good deal is a good deal no matter where you find it. Another thing I do is go and see lots of agents. Over the course of the next year or two, visit 50 commercial real estate agents or brokers and say, hey, I'm in the game. I'm looking for property, hopefully one with a bit of a twist. I'm not worried if there's a vacancy there or if it's completely vacant. I'm probably not going to buy it completely vacant, but I might look for a tenant first. And if I can find a tenant, then I might be in the market to buy it. And these are all things you can do to find out properties and let it be known. When you're visiting the dentist, notwithstanding the fact that most of the time you've got your mouth open with instruments inside it so that you can't speak much. But when the dentist or the dental assistant says to you, well, what have you been up to lately? Instead of saying a bland statement like, well, much of the same, I mowed the lawns last Saturday and we went to the movies the other day. That's just not saying anything. Say, well, actually, I am now a commercial real estate investor, and I know it's a small chance, but on the off chance you know of any commercial space being available, if you wouldn't mind letting me know, I'd really appreciate it. That is going to sound so corny and dumb to you at first, because you're not in your heart perhaps going to feel that you truly are a commercial real estate investor. But remember, being a commercial real estate investor involves a lot of psychology too, where you have to believe it yourself. So you start saying that, and you say it to the dental assistant and the guy at the service station who asks you what you're up to, and your cousin's friend, and your third cousin twice removed, and everyone else. And then after 3 months, you're going to get a phone call from one of those people. You will be stunned which one it ends up being. And they're going to say, are you still looking at commercial real estate? Because down the road from where I live, there used to be a gas station there, and it's shut down. And I believe there might be an environmental something going on there where the land might be a bit contaminated. But for that reason, it's going for a song. And I heard the quote on what it would cost to take out the contaminated land, and it's not very much. And I think it would make a good storage facility, or a good this or a good that. Or maybe they don't have those details for you. It doesn't matter. You'll get leads. And I know we are a society of instant gratification. That's why we like instant coffee and Jiffy Lubes and every other thing that happens in a hurry. And commercial real estate doesn't usually happen in a hurry. You might look at 50 properties, and for some reason they all fall over and they don't turn out to be exactly what you wanted them to be. But at the end of the day, if you just do one deal a year, that can set you financially free forever. And if you do one commercial deal a year for 5 years, you may never have to work another day in your life. It is worth putting the effort in. I know it's work, but it's worth putting the work in. And then you'll be surprised what you might get as a result of that. So, you can use creative financing. The great thing about commercial that's made me enormous amounts of money is that the value of a commercial building isn't based on comps, similar area, similar age, similar condition. No, it's based purely on how much revenue does it generate. And if you can figure out a way of increasing the revenue, then you've figured out a way of increasing the value. And if you double or triple the value, you've doubled or tripled what the bank will use as the value. And then if they give you only 50% of that, 50% of double is the purchase price, if you follow my reasoning. It's a great formula for ongoing wealth and success. So I've given you 4 tips as to what you can do to increase your chances of acquiring commercial real estate. Every time you put an offer in to buy a commercial real estate, always ask, not sometimes, not usually, not often, always ask, will you be willing to leave some money in? And trust me, sometimes for them, that will be a godsend. They will actually appreciate being made that offer. Figure out what else you can do with the building. Maybe in another podcast, I'll talk about some of the things I've done to massively change the value of a building. Because once you get it, once you've done it once or twice, and you realize that by putting that news feed on the roof, or an antenna system, or a satellite repeater station, or whatever, that you can rent out, or a helipad on the roof, or a cell phone tower there that generates 100,000 a year. And because it generates 100,000 a year at a 10% cap rate, that increases the value of the building by $1 million. And if it's only a 5% cap rate, which is more typical these days, that would be $2 million. It is just phenomenal. And it's limited by your creativity. That's one of the great things I love about commercial real estate. It is literally limited only by your creativity. So anyway, we've run out of time, but I'm going to come back with more ideas on what you can do to massively increase the value of your commercial real estate just by using your brain power. And that's why I always say the most valuable piece of real estate is the 6 inches, give or take an inch or two, between your right ear and your left ear, because it's what you create in that space that ultimately will determine your net worth. See you again soon. And in the meantime, I want to wish you, as always, successful investing. Thank you.